Hey, well, good morning. I hope you guys all had a good 4th of July. And it looks like everyone's fingers are still intact, so fireworks must have been successful. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. We spent the weekend starting to potty train our second. So that's fun for those of you who haven't gotten into that world yet. We're at the point where we're trying negotiations to get anything to happen, right? It's like, do you want a trip to Disney? Just please get potty trained. So that's where we are emotionally and physically. But excited for this morning because we get to continue in our series on David. We have been looking at the man after God's own heart over the course of this summer. And today we're specifically going to be looking at 1 Samuel 21 through 23, and we're going to pick out a few segments to focus on today. But this is the section where David is fleeing from King Saul. And fear is a weird thing, right? It's an interesting thing when you start to think about some of the emotions around fear, because there's some fear that we need to respond with instantly, right? Where if you're being chased by a lion, it's better to just make a quick decision and run, right? But there's others there, maybe we have some time to think about what we're going to do from it. And often it's actually even more interesting to figure out what we run to. Right, if we're fearful of something, if there's something going on in our lives, what do we run to? For some of us, it can be a thing. Maybe it's a substance. Maybe there's an addiction that we run to when we're fearful of something or discontent in something. Or maybe it's people. These people could be wise. They might not be wise. But what do we run to? For me personally, I have a fear of darkness. Anyone else not like the dark? Or is it just a kid thing that I've continued to have throughout my life? I am fine being in the dark as long as my wife is there to protect me at night, which is why I got married at an early age. But one thing that I brought into our household with the whole idea of fear is night terrors. Does anyone have night terrors? Okay, I'm the weird one. Okay, anyone know people who have night terrors? It's terrifying, right? It's a wild thing. So I have time for one story this morning, quick. When I first moved before me and Jillian got married, we bought a house. And when I first moved into the house, when I was alone in there for like 6 months, there was a night where I had a night terror. So I was in bed and I woke up and I knew something was in the room with me. I just had this thought that something was in there. So I jumped up on our bed and I had the door closed. And somehow I thought, like, I'm a big enough man to bust through that door, right? Like, I jumped off the bed and I lower my shoulder like I'm a linebacker and go to slam through the door. And what I didn't remember is that I'm 150 pounds soaking wet, and that door was stronger than I was. So I bounced off the door like a rag doll. And at that point, I'm starting to come to out of my night terror, but I'm also confused to why I just hit a door. So that's going on in my head. So at that point, I still have the fear of something. I must have been fearful of something, so I've got to get out of this room. And so I jump on my bed. On top of the bed is the window. So I throw open the window, and I'm about to slam through the screen to get outside. And I realize I don't really have enough clothes on to run around outside right now. And that's where I start to process, hang on, what's actually real right now? And no one else is in the house, so I was pretty fearful, but it's like, what's actually real? And I stood on my bed processing that, and then there's a moment where you feel really dumb about yourself because you're like, what have I just done? And then you go check the door for damage because you think you hit it way harder than you did. But fear is a weird thing, right? Fear, it comes with lots of different emotions and different effects. But it's an interesting thing to figure out how we respond to different types of fear in our life. And today we're going to look at how David responded to some fear in his life and what he did in those moments. But before we jump into the Bible, I want to give you a quick recap if you missed last week, because last week was a little bit different. We got to celebrate VBS with the other service. And with the VBS service, the service was really shrunk down to the message part. So I want to give you a little bit of a recap of how we got here. Because we know David's been anointed to be king. If you've been with us through the summer, you know he's been anointed to be the future king, but is not king yet. And there comes a point where David realizes that he may need to start fearing King Saul. Because King Saul in chapter 9 was sitting in his house with a spear in his hands. It says this: David was playing the lyre for him, and Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall, and that night David made good his escape. So David escapes from King Saul and starts to process, hang on, I don't think I should be in King Saul's presence anymore. There's something going on here. And he actually goes to Jonathan at that point, who is King Saul's son. And he asks Jonathan these things. He says, what have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father? Is he trying to kill me? At that point, David and Jonathan come up with this plan to figure out, okay, was Saul just having a bad day, or is Saul actually intending to kill David here? And they find out really quickly that Saul is very much trying to kill him, and Jonathan sends David away, says, get out of Dodge. It is time to get out of here and flee from King Saul, which is where our story picks up today in 1 Samuel 21. And I'm going to, if we could pull up the picture here a minute, I'm going to read the first verse and then kind of explain some of the relationship to where we're at in here. So verse 10 says, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. So I don't know if you can see, Gath is the left circle here, that's circled. And then Gibeah is up at the top, that is where King Saul's that's where his palace, his headquarters would have been. And then we've got Jerusalem underneath there, which is where David would have been most likely living at that time. So David fled from Saul and went to Gath. All right, so now to give you a little bit of distances in here, the distance from Jerusalem to Gath would have been about 26 miles, and the distance from Jerusalem to Gibeah would have been about 3 miles there. So David flees down to Jerusalem and then flees to Gath from there. Now, if you were here a few weeks ago, why does Gath ring a bell? Anyone? Why does Gath be like, okay, there's something there? Goliath. Yes. Okay, so David, just a while ago, a few years back, kills Goliath, who is kind of the hero of Gath. Sirs, you're confused as I am. So David decides to flee to the very city that he just killed the hero of. Okay, does that part make sense? Okay, of all the nations, of all the cities he goes to flee to, he actually flees to one that the people there probably aren't super excited to see him. Right, okay, so that's where our story picks up. And knowing some of that history, we'll jump in here. Verse 11, but the servants of Achish, who's the king of that area, said to him, isn't this David the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Now, it's important to note here, if we don't know the history on Gath and what has just happened there, we can look at those words and say, oh, they're being endearing of him, they're excited to see David. No, they're super not. They're not excited to see him. They don't want David there because he just recently had killed their hero. It continues. Verse 12, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, look at the man. He is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of men that you have brought this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? Now, reading these words, we don't hear much about what's going on in David's head, right? 1 Samuel, in this chapter specifically, we get a lot of the facts of what's going on. They are here. David goes here. He has this conversation with the king. People bring him to the king. It's very factual in this. But the Psalms, it's very interesting because the Psalms are a book of mostly songs that were written throughout the Old Testament that are compiled together. And we get a glimpse of David's heart in one of these Psalms. Because I don't know about you, but reading through the Psalms, I've done it in one period, not one period, but all the way through at one point, and you can get kind of lost in the songs, right? But when we look at the headings here, if you have your Bible, jump to Psalm 56. Because I think what's fascinating about this here is we get a glimpse of this. Psalm 56, the heading in there, if you've got your Bible with you, says, "For the director of music." So it was a song. "To the tune of a dove on distant oaks." And I'm not going to try sing that for you today because I couldn't find what that meant. "Of David, a miktam," which it would have been a version of song. And it says this, "When the Philistines had seized him in Gath." Okay, so this is the only time we know David to have been seized in Gath. So we can put this psalm actually right in line with this with First Samuel 19 here, that this psalm ties directly into our story here. So I want to read that for you now a minute, because I think it brings to light where David's posture is and where his heart is. It says this, "Be merciful to me, my God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. My adversaries pursue me all day long. In their pride many are attacking me. When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, in God whose word I praise. In God I trust and am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? All day long they twist my words. All their schemes are for my ruin. They conspire, they lurk, they watch my steps, hoping to take my life. Because of their wickedness, do not let them escape in your anger, God. Bring their nations down." See, what's interesting, if you picture David in Gath, in an enemy nation where he's trying to seek refuge, all of a sudden these words come a bit more alive, right? Verse 8, "Record my misery, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record? Then my enemies will turn back when I call for help. But this I will know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust and am not afraid. What can man do to me? I am under vows to you, my God. I will present my thank offerings to you. For you have delivered me from death and my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." So David's words here in Psalm 56 give us a bit more of a window into what's going on here. The story from 1 Samuel doesn't actually tell us that David's been captured, right? It tells us he goes to Gath and then has to become a man. But when we tie these stories together, it's like, oh, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we actually don't see right away. See, apparently, David had to become like a madman. We read that in the first Samuel section, right? But what we see him do in this, in order to escape, is we see him first go to God in a very different way. He first has a lot of fear about what's going on, but in about halfway through, we all of a sudden see that fear turn to praise. Right, we see David start praising, and God does pull him out of Gath. God does get him out of Gath, but in an unexpected way. I would argue that God may have some humor in the way that he took David out in, because we see David probably is like a man going to the nation that he just recently killed their hero. Right, he's a man for doing that. And God may have said, okay, you're a man for doing that. You're going to need to become literally a man to get out of it. Because we read that he had saliva going down his beard. He was scratching at the doors, and he was foaming at the mouth. So basically, David humiliated himself in front of the Philistines to escape, because he's brought before the king. And at that point, if we understand, David has the reputation of being this strong force, this guy who killed Goliath, this future king. Like when he's talked about well, right? When he walked into this nation of Gath, they had heard about the songs that people had sung about David. He had this reputation. And when David gets brought forth before the king and pretends to be a man, the king says, there's no way this could be David. Not the David we know about. There's absolutely no way. Get him out of my presence. When it says he had saliva dripping down his beard, that would have been a very true form of a man. Because in that culture, salivating like that on your beard would have been very disrespectful. It would have been, you just wouldn't have done that back in that day. I don't know. I haven't been able to grow a beard yet, so maybe someday I'll fully figure out what that means. But they would have known, like, okay, this can't be David because he is a true man. So the king sends him out. Get him away. Get him out of our presence here. So that's how David gets out of Gath after being captured in Gath. But that leads us into chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. But understanding this, David can't be in Jerusalem, right? He can't be in his home. He can't be in the palace of Saul because he's already been threatened to be killed. He can't go to Jonathan, the son of Saul, his best friend, to talk about what's going on because Saul's watching Jonathan. And he couldn't go to the house of the Lord, and now he figures out he can't go to the ungodly in Gath, right? He's kind of stuck. He's tried all of the different options, it seems like. So what does David do? Where does he go? And this is where our story continues. 1 Samuel 22, starting at verse 1. It says this: David left Gath and escaped to a cave in Adullam. And I want to pause here for a moment and show you what these caves look like. So if you can jump to the next picture a minute. So this would have been what this cave looks like. And do you have an aerial view of this, Micah? There we go. Okay, so he would have fled to this area, and you can see this is a current day photo, but it gets you a good image of what the landscape would have looked like. There's not a ton of like civilizations there, so he could have easily hidden in this cave area. And could you go to? I think there's one more map. If you go back, there we go. So we've got Gath off to the side here again. That hasn't moved, and he escapes down to the right to Adullam. So. And then you can go back to those other pictures, scan through those a minute again to give you a better idea. So David goes to these caves and he's hiding in these caves. And what's interesting is most archaeologists are, you know what I'm saying, right? Okay, Matt, you're going to make me say it, aren't you? No, so most are. I'm not going to say it. Most of the smart people who dig up rocks believe that that in that day and age, that this Adullam, the caves of Adullam, would not have been far from that valley that David struck down Goliath. So think, David at his peak so far in his life, when he struck down Goliath in this valley, and I'm sure he's hoisted on everyone's shoulders, he's praised, and now a few years later, he's in a cave and he's alone and he can't go to his best friend. And he was told that he was going to be king, but he's far from king and he doesn't have any people surrounding him. And you can imagine the thoughts that are going through in his head, right? He's been run out of Dodge. He's been run out of town and he doesn't know where to go. And this is where we find David, probably sitting outside one of these caves. Maybe he makes a fire, and he's overlooking an area where he was just once praised. So he's in a very different posture, right? He's in a very different position that he thought he would be. He was told he'd be king. He's slain this hero of Gath that was against the Israelites, and now what? What does it look like now for his life? And instead of continuing in our story that has a lot of facts, I want to jump into the Psalms again because it gives us another glimpse into the emotions of what David has. Because in Psalm 57, so if you jump into the next psalm, the heading again says, for the director of music, to the tune of Do Not Destroy. That sounds like an 80s band song, doesn't it? I bet that was wonderful. To the song of Do Not Destroy of David, Miktam, when he fled from Saul into a cave. So with the positioning of the Psalms here so close together, there's There's a lot that points to this is probably the moment, this is probably the cave that David is speaking about when he flees to Adullam. It says this, "Have mercy on me, O God, have mercy on me, for in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. I cry out to God Most High, to God who vindicates me. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends forth his love and his faithfulness. I'm in the midst of lions, and I'm forced to dwell among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth. They spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love, reaching to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the sky. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all of the earth." What I love about this, and what I love about fully understanding the context of how some of these psalms are written, is you can fully picture this. Right? David's alone, and he's scared, and he's fearful, and he's sitting outside a cave alone without anyone around him, thinking, God, what are you doing in this? And in the fear, just like we see from Psalm 56, he turns that fear and he turns that confusion and that sorrow of, God, what are you doing, into praise. He ends all of these last two Psalms into praise. He looks to God in this. We see David's heart starting to be transformed into trusting what God is doing, as opposed to questioning and making some moves on his own. But what I find most interesting is that David turns his fear to praise even before his situation's been fixed. But I think for us, often we say, okay, I'll turn to God, I'll praise when my situation is what I want it to be. Right? And often we question God in the midst of it, and we don't praise God in the hardest moments in here. But what we have to understand in this story is that David is still in the cave, right? It's still bleak. We can read the story and know what's coming and know he becomes king and all these great things happen, but he is in the thick of it. And yet David is still turning to praise from his fear even before he knows what is about to come. Okay, let's continue. 1 Samuel 22, I want to read verse 1 again here so we get the context again. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Where his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. So we don't fully understand, we don't exactly know when these men came to him, when his family heard that David was there, and when these discontented people started to gather around him. But I do firmly believe that these words from the Psalms happened before that. Right? You can get a sense of David's wrestling alone through some of these things. And I would argue that in that, when he turns to praise from that fear, okay, picture this. David is told he's anointed, right? He's been anointed king. And you would think that his posture is like, okay, I'm king now. Something starts to happen. You would think, like, okay, I've got to start getting people around me as this future king. I need to make sure I have an army prepared for Saul and whatever happens to me. But David isn't doing that. Somehow, some way, people start figuring out that he's in this cave, and his family comes around him, and then these discontented people come around them. Like, God is literally bringing people to his doorstep without David going petitioning and campaigning around like, oh, I need people around me. These people come to him. It feels a bit like Noah's Ark, right? Like, God brings the people to him, for him. Okay, our story continues. From there, Verse 3, from there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? So he left them with the king of Moab and stayed with him as long as David was in their stronghold. Now there's a line in there that sticks out to me. After he asked permission, he said, till I know what God will do for me. I look at this and I see a crucial difference in here that I think we need to make note of. David's been making a lot of decisions lately. When he's in fear, he runs immediately to this enemy nation of Gath. He makes a lot of decisions based on his fear irrationally because he's fearful, which we get, right? He is in fear of being killed. So of course he's trying to make some decisions quickly, but he's making those decisions without God. And all of a sudden we see this posture shift from him where he's communicating, I don't know what God's next move is going to be. And until then, I'm going to sit here and wait. So instead of continuing to run in fear, David says, till I know what God will do for me. But we can all understand that this waiting can be frustrating. Right? We can understand why David would run, why David would make immediate decisions, because he didn't know what was coming. He was ready to be king, and yet nothing was lining up like he thought it would. And it doesn't come naturally to us either to wait in fear and to wait on God to do something. Because it is easier to just start running and making decisions and then look back behind us and say, oh, I probably should have asked God what was the right move in this or not. The question I want us to wrestle with, a few questions actually. What are you running from? We can look at the story of David and understand, okay, there's definite fear there, but let's turn it inwards. What are you running from? And better yet, what are you running to? See, fears are a very real thing. And I think our bodies are designed beautifully that there's moments that we respond to fear even before our brain can comprehend what's going on. Right? When we touch a hot stove, all of a sudden before we tell our hand, hey, that's hot, right? Our brain pulls our hand off of it, right? So some of those things are good. Like we have immediate reactions to some things, but we need to focus on what, with those other fears that we may have time to figure out what to do and where to turn to, what do we actually run to? Right? Where do we actually go? If we are in fear, what do we actually do with that? For David, in the first part of our story, he runs exactly opposite of God, right? He runs to the Philistines, the enemy nation, where there's lots of gods that they serve. It's not a safe place for him to be in to get closer with God. But he realizes his mistakes, and as we read through them in the Psalms, we see how that fear and failure turns into praise. And I don't think, as we look at these stories, it's a coincidence that that David finally actually turns his fear to praise when he's in solitude. Right, when he finally gets away, when he finally gets out of the chaos of the culture and the chaos of the world, is when he's able to turn into praise. And when he's actually able to have more of a conversation with God. We see that even in the life of Jesus. In the last moments of Jesus, the last few nights, he has a moment with his disciples where he knows what's about to take place. And he goes and he spends time in solitude in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus had some real fears. He was the Son of God and had fears. And what he did in those moments is he went to God and presented those fears to God in solitude. And I think that speaks highly for us that if we look at David, if we look at the life of Jesus, and we see what they did in fear, especially when David did it rightly, he goes to God, right? He goes to God in that fear. I think often when my girls, McKenna is at the age where she has some nightmares. Macy has started having night terrors, I'm so sorry for you. I pass this along for you. But Kenna will have some nightmares. And she'll run out of bed screaming, and I'll jump out of bed, and she'll run into my arms, and she's terrified of something, right? You can just tell that. And after I get over the fact of you're making me lose precious sleep that I super need, right? You get to that point of there's a beautiful peace that I can comfort her as dad. Right? When I get down on my knee and she jumps into my arms, there's a beautiful moment where she feels safe in my arms. And she doesn't want me to let her go. And all of a sudden, that fear that she had, though it may be very real to her, she feels protected in my arms, right? She knows who to go to. And I can explain to her, we can talk through her fears, even in the middle of the night, like, no, I'm bigger than most of the fears that she has, right? I'm here to protect you. And I'm here to keep you safe. We've built this house around you. We've locked the doors. I have done all the things to protect you that I can do. And trying to explain that to her and rationalize that with her. And I think there's a beautiful piece of that for us too. When we go to God, we actually realize that God is way bigger than all of the problems that we have, right? When we understand the character of God and who He is and the way He is there for us, when we run to God, when we run into His arms, we realize that any problems that we might have, any fears that we're dealing with, He is way bigger than those things. I want to invite the band up here because we're going to end with a really good song. But I want us to think about this moment that David has. And I think that even Jesus has in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it's a weird phrase because it doesn't seem like it's two things that could work together well, but the movement of emotions from turning fear into praise. Right? David did it, but it's hard for us sometimes to comprehend, like, how do you go from being fearful of something and still being in the midst of that fear and somehow having to move into praise without that fear being fixed? Right? That's a hard thing to do. But that is what I think is so beautiful, is that when we start to get the posture of God, when we start to understand who God is and understand the character of what He provides for us, and realize that He is bigger than all of the problems that we have. Maybe it's time for us to figure out, who are we actually running to in our fears? And if our fears are not being subsided, maybe we've been running to the wrong thing. Maybe we've been running to the wrong people. Maybe we've been running to the wrong substance, and that's not fixing it. But it's not a surprise, because those fears that we have cannot be fixed by worldly things often. We need to find something that's bigger than our fears, and that is only of God. I challenge you, do not let that fear dictate the people that you are. Right? I don't know what fears you've walked in here, and I'm not going to make you say them out loud. Right? But over the course of this morning, maybe the Holy Spirit has nudged something in your life, and you've said, that is a fear I've been working with. And maybe you've been running to the wrong place or running to the wrong substance to try and fix those things. But don't let that fear dictate the kind of person you are. I want to challenge you guys to run to the Father. And as we wrap up, I want you to hear these words being poured over you as we respond in praise from fear.